near zero marginal cost energy, right? Superabundance. The data centers for AI can all gravitate towards those nodes, right? This is really amazing innovation opportunity for everybody all over the world. Job creation, bringing people out of poverty in a clean way. Fossil fuels brought people out of poverty to some extent, but in a dirty way. When you have 8 billion people burning 1.5 million years worth of fossilized matter every week, it's unsustainable.
Welcome to a special live edition of Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations. I am your host, Richard Delavan. Very excited to be here at the Extreme Hangout during London Climate Action Week 2025 here at the gorgeous Ladbroke Hall. Very grateful to our partners at Extreme Hangout for allowing us to use their wonderful space. We're having a very interesting conversation today, I think you'll agree. Our conversation is centered on a fundamental divide in today's climate discourse. On one side, represented by a person who's going to be joining us in just a moment, techno-optimists who believe abundance is the key, a future where innovation frees us from the constraints of scarcity, on extraction, on emissions, on power. On the other hand, many climate activists argue that those limits need to be made manifest, that we are living beyond our means, beyond the planetary boundaries, and that the only way to make sure that we do not advance beyond climate tipping points is to ensure that we maintain those limits. So this presents a fundamental tension. And I think it lies at the heart of climate tech, which is why we're also represented, we also have with us today an entrepreneur starting her own business in the climate tech space. So let me introduce the members of our panel who are here so far. Michael Spiekermann was a co-founder of the Fridays for Future chapter in Österreich, Austria, a climate policy student now at the London School of Economics. His TEDx talk and work with Greta Thunberg argue that climate change is fundamentally a moral and political challenge. Is that right, Michael? And could you tell us a little bit about your background? As your journey is very interesting. You've come from activism to, I mean, not many people, I imagine, go from activism to studying at the LSE. It's an unusual choice. Tell us about that.
Well, I think that's already the third stage. Probably I started being musician.
Okay.
After being a musician, I became a climate activist because I was confronted to the reality that is probably facing us if we do not try to keep temperature between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So what happens if we exceed 3 degrees? That was what we learned at university, and it somehow triggered me. So I became an activist.
Okay.
Now I'm studying here because I think in London, in general, studying can give you a great understanding how policymaking can be effective, how you can get stuff done. And this is super important to combine the activist narrative with the actual problem-solving skills in the political landscape.
Because I mean, we were talking before in the green room about how unexpected results from policy decisions are ones that sometimes get locked in, and we have negative incentives. So I mean, we were talking a little bit about some of the negative pricing in electricity in Austria, which was not expected as some choices of policy there. Also with us is Yasmine Abdu, an entrepreneur with an AI startup called Carbon Track. Everyone's got an AI startup these days. It's great. Building scalable, human-centric tools for product-level carbon tracking and change. Recently won an award at the Conduit for being able to support that business and get some mentorship from someone who will be here shortly. Yasmine, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your journey, how you came to be working and setting up Carbon Track.
So I'm a chemical engineer by background. I enjoy solving problems in my free time. So you'd find me at different hackathons at weekends. And at one hackathon, I came to the realization that 34% of world emissions come from food. And 80% of Gen Z and millennials want to make more sustainable choices, but only 12% actively take action. So there's a 66% gap of people that want to do more, but just can't. So we interviewed 1,176 people and found that the biggest barrier wasn't a lack of willingness. It was more of a lack of clarity and convenience. And that's where Carbon Track comes in. We simplify, gamify, and reward sustainable grocery shopping by integrating directly into supermarket loyalty cards.
Very good. And I suppose that what we're going to have joining us in just a moment is Charles Perry, the sustainability strategist who also works with folks at Rethink X, Jamie Arbib, and Tony Seba, who wrote the book Stellar. don't know if anyone in the audience has read the book. I think one or two people have. Good, okay. And I would argue that Stellar fits in a family of other texts that have argued for this post-scarcity world. And I think questions I have about the book might come to in a moment, but I think the basic core argument is that it's possible and desirable to get to a world beyond scarcity. Whether it be unlimited energy from solar PV, or whether it be the ability of AI and robots to make as many things as we would like, which sounds great, and certainly has become very popular in my home country, in the US, as part of the political discourse, as an alternative to the kind of austerity politics that we often hear about. And so Ezra Klein, New York Times columnist, has co-written a book that came out recently that basically argues that this should not only be possible, but should be the anchor for one of the political parties' programs. They cite in their book earlier iterations of this argument, like from Aaron Bastani, who co-founded Novara Media here in the UK and wrote a book called Fully Automated Luxury Communism. And if you've never seen it, I would recommend it highly, because a lot of things he wrote, this is, 10 years ago now, anticipate some of the debates we're having today. So, on the one hand, we have this vision that we shouldn't have to live within limits. And on the other, the idea is whether that's a dangerous delusion, or whether, in fact, it is something we should both try to achieve and achieve. So, I'll come back to the arguments that for abundance in a minute, but Mike, I want to start with you. In terms of, do you buy this argument? Should we be able to live in a world where we don't have to worry about limits? Is that a desirable state of being?
Well, I think that political change is difficult, especially when you need to bring a lot of people on board, which is the case in the climate crisis. So I do think that the narrative helps us to mobilize people. It is something that seems to be desirable for many people. We are living in a time where many people struggle with a cost of living crisis. In many countries, this cost of living crisis is driven by energy prices. It's important to note at this point that this is mostly not because of renewables that are now coming more and more on the grids, but rather, especially if we think about European electricity prices coming from the geopolitical landscape now, with the war in Ukraine that is driving the costs of gas to a very high level, and is therefore costing people a lot of money on the electricity bill. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, I think if we take the broadest picture, it is always the question whether the model and the understanding of wealth that we have is still the one that we should have in the 21st century. Because I think for most people, when they think of wealth, it is about material wealth. This is coming from a time where we had very few things. If you actually just count the number of things that people have today, it's much more, it's by 100 times more than for the time it used to be after the Second World War, for example. And I think there is a very important discussion that we should lead as a society. About what we actually consider as wealth. Maybe it is immaterial wealth. Maybe it is our families. Maybe it is time that we can spend with our community, with our neighbors, with our children, with our pets. They're actually making our lives better.
Well, I guess the question is, there are a lot of economists who would love to see how you value that and how you put it into a GDP figure. So we could debate that, I suppose. But I guess I wanted to ask, just with your activist hat on, I mean, again, you're not here speaking as a spokesperson for Fridays for Future, but it is part of your heritage. I mean, can you just maybe reflect a little bit about, what kinds of, how important limits were in the kind of stories that you were telling, and the stories that were animating what spokespeople for Fridays for the Future and many other organizations are saying about what's necessary. Because I suppose the whole abundance narrative seems to be a response to the idea of degrowth or limits to growth, whether the original Club of Rome 1972 work, basically that the idea that that's simply a loser, both of the political project, but also the idea that it leads to stagnation, which leads to zero-sum thinking, which leads to people knifing each other for basics to get through the day. So, what is the theory of change, and how does it involve limits? Would you say in terms of some of the activists that you've worked with in the past?
Well, I think the one point that we can all agree on is a limit on the emissions on greenhouse gases. That's probably the most fundamental limit that we have. That requires us to shift away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. But I think there are a couple of different pathways that we could imagine. And that depends very much on the choices of a society. So, I mean, of course, there are ways how you can decrease the consumption of people that would lead to a quite dramatic reduction of fossil fuel emissions. The question is whether this is the way that our society wants to go. It is, I think, important to listen to people, to shape the narrative, and then also to find good policy solutions. And I think the policy solutions are often a part that we tend to overlook. So, in Austria, for example, we recently had a couple of policies that were introduced in order to bring more batteries to households. So batteries in Austria, the country I come from, were subsidized, which led to a lot of uptake of batteries from Austrian households. Nevertheless, the government was well intended, but they thought that people would just apply the batteries in a meaningful way, which means, for example, charging the batteries at noon, when we have a lot of surplus electricity from solar, and to decharge the batteries when we need the electricity, which is not the case. People did not do it in this meaningful way. People, as we know now, just tend to charge the batteries in the morning, which led to a scarcity of electricity in the morning, which drove the electricity price up. And we now, especially in the summer, have nearly every noon negative electricity prices in Austria, because people are applying the batteries in the wrong way. And politics, in this case, did not give the right incentives. It would have been possible. You could have given the right incentives, but the government did not pay enough attention. So I think this is a very beautiful example of how crucial it is that we also, apart from the narrative, look at how we can get things done as policymakers, like how we can get our policymakers to really implement meaningful stuff.
So activism and policymaking is one field. Another field is actually creating value in business. And Yasmine, I wanted to ask you, tell us a little bit more about the origins here. You're talking about ways, you surveyed a bunch of folks, or Gen Z and millennials, about the choices they would make if only they had the right information. I think that's the core of your thesis. But your customers, your off-takers for the software platform that you're building are principally going to be supermarkets, correct?
Yep.
So what's the problem you're solving for them?
So a lot of it is to do with the evolving regulations from the government, and they're obviously continuously evolving. Different regulations are coming all the time. So that's one of the primary things we're looking at. Another one is just general marketing. So green marketing is becoming more of a thing. Greenwashing is also in the rise, but how do you sort of shift your sort of thinking from the greenwashing towards actual green marketing, using actual proper data, by shifting people's actions?
And I've heard people say that green hushing is more of a challenge now than greenwashing, in the sense that people want to run away from the claims that they have any association with climate or any benefits to climate or limiting emissions, that there are really more tangible economic benefits, for the people who will be actors in that system. What's your view? Is that an argument that we should continue to be able to make, or someone like yourself as an entrepreneur, are you relying solely on kind of market incentives, economic incentives, rather than these less tangible climate benefits?
No, I guess we can also create value in terms of profits for the different stakeholders. So the way we operate our business model is through a SaaS revenue sharing hybrid. And essentially the extra profit we drive for supermarkets due to the higher price points of sustainable choices. Part of that extra revenue funds the customer's rewards pool to incentivize people's actions. And by incentives, we're not talking about something like 10 pence, we're talking about something meaningful, like £5. And yeah, so essentially incentives.
Okay. And we're now joined also by Charles Perry. Charles.
Hello, Richard.
Good
Hi,
afternoon.
Michael. Hi, Yasmine. Hello, everybody. Sorry I'm late.
So for those who, again, people of course do know Charles, but just to remind of our audience, he's a sustainability strategist with long experience, I think it's fair to say. Also a advisor to Rethink X, and also has had some influence, which could be said, on the book Stellar, which we were discussing. A copy there, perhaps if someone can hold it up. But thank you for that. Great. And so, Charles, I wanted to ask you, because I think we were trying to reprise some of the arguments in Stellar and the vision of the future that it tries to get across, of having this post-scarcity world and the ways that we get there. And I suppose my question initially is really, is this a good thing? Is it something that we really desire? Maybe can you give us an idea about how the Stellar vision redefines this idea of abundance?
Sure, Richard. One of the central quotes is from Buckminster Fuller, and there's nothing about a caterpillar that tells you it's going to become a butterfly. And I really love that. For me, it summarizes really what the book's all about, which is, we're stuck in the extractive paradigm, which is the caterpillar, and we're putting wings on the caterpillar, sticking them on, with the sort of trying to just add a bit of renewables here and there to the existing infrastructure, expecting this is going to fly. But, it helps a bit, but it's sort of band-aiding a system that needs total revolution, total change. And the paradigm we really need to move to is what Tony Seba and Jamie Arbob call stellar. So if you think of a star, think of the qualities of a star, right? Nature, energetic, restorative, regenerative, infinitely possible. The possibilities are infinite. It's circular. It's sustainable. So this is the new paradigm is really beyond the fossil fuel era, moving from a fossil fuel powered paradigm to a internet of energy plus robotics and AI, artificial labor age, where it's super abundant, because if you've got solar, wind, and batteries, for example, with robotics and AI, you suddenly have much more energy than we've ever dreamt of. I mean, fossil fuels are limited, and they have obviously pollution as the problem, whereas the internet of energy age could give us all sorts of new possibilities. And the idea is that these stars will pop up all over in the decentralization of energy. And they'll be connected like nodes of the internet in terms of how the internet was created, the islands that became the World Wide Web. This will be the nodes that become the internet of energy. And that cannibalizes the existing infrastructure, like the national grid in this country, which is totally antiquated. And was built 200 odd years ago for molecules and for centralized power, where the generation is miles away from the consumption, because no one wants to live next to a coal-fired power station or a gas-fired power station or a nuclear-fired power station. But no one will mind living in an embedded generation internet of energy age, because solar, wind, batteries can be integrated, especially small wind turbines, especially, for example, wind turbines that do this rather than necessarily that, right? So vertical axis as opposed to horizontal axis wind turbines. All of these are still coming, and the cost curves have already undercut the fossil fuel ones. So why wouldn't we do it? If it's cheaper, it's cleaner, it's the internet of energy, it provides more economic opportunity than we've had since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
Well, I guess to play devil's advocate, one reason would be that no one makes any profit from that world. And in fact, you've just mentioned the national grid and other infrastructure players, where in fact the stranded assets that would be the result of a move to this world of abundance beyond extraction, beyond scarcity, would mean that a good portion of the world's wealth would cease to have any value, because those assets would no longer be productive, they would have to be unused. And so what do you know, it sounds lovely, but the vested interests that would be aligned to prevent that from ever happening, and by vested interests, I don't just mean mustache-twirling, oil executives. I mean people with pension funds that rely on returns from these companies. What do we tell the pensioner who's like to say, like, well, sorry about that. Maybe in 50 years we're going to have abundance, but in the meantime we're going to destroy all the value of your pension?
Yeah, look, I think my country, South Africa, came up with a great phrase, which has now become synonymous worldwide with this. It's called just transition. And it has to be a just transition, because one of the biggest problems we've got is inequity in the world. I mean, look at 20 billionaires in America have more wealth than the rest of the world put together, basically. So we can't, that's unsustainable. So we have to have a change, both for people and planet, because both are suffering. And there's a transition which is undergoing at the moment. So, for example, we've just stopped coal in the UK, whereas we pioneered the Industrial Revolution with coal. So things are changing. My country, South Africa, is 90% coal still, which is a relic of apartheid, unfortunately. But it means that a lot of people's jobs are tied up in the coal mines, because cheap, mostly black labor was the reason that South African white people got wealthy, really, during apartheid. And so there's a political issue about changing too quickly away from coal in South Africa, unless the skills can move and the jobs are created fast enough in, for example, regenerative agriculture instead of coal mining, right? So there is a transition phase. But I think what these guys are pointing out in Stella is that we can't stay stuck in extractive. We've been in extractive since the Neolithic Revolution, 9,000 years ago. Before that, we were hunter-gatherers. We were very collaborative. We looked after each other. We looked after the planet as hunter-gatherers. Then we had the Neolithic Revolution, and we forgot about looking after the people, the planet and people. It was, I get it, or you get it, can't both have it. So we fight over land, labor, and capital, and we look for it at the cheapest cost. And that's unsustainable. I mean, so the question implicit in the Stella book is what happens to capitalism. I used to be of the view that capitalism is evolved by internalizing externalities and stuff like that. I now believe there's a much better way ahead, which is a new ism, actually. So forget about Marxism, communism, socialism, capitalism, all of the isms we've had in the past. I think it's high time we move to a whole new ism. And it could be as simple as stellarism or something. But it's got to have nature, it's got to model nature, and it's got to have nature at the heart of it.
I mean, it's an interesting tension, though, right? If nature is at the heart of it, why is AI the key enabling technology that actually brings about this world? And given the fact that, so far anyway, the demand growth for power, driven by AI is just generating more demand for natural gas turbines and nuclear power. And interestingly, you say that people don't want to live near a nuclear plant. If you live within 5 kilometers of a nuclear plant in France, you get electricity for free for life, which is one of the reasons that public opinion in France towards nuclear is very different than a lot of other places. So it just sounds like it's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, it might be, but I think a lot of people don't really know what happens with nuclear power. For example, water. Do people know about what happens to ocean temperature? Because most nuclear power plants are on the ocean, right, for a good reason, because they need the ocean water to cool the reactors. That water goes back 10 degrees centigrade warmer. So think what that does to the coastal marine life. So the radioactive waste that comes from nuclear power stations. In this country, if you become energy minister, the first thing you find out is that 2/3 of your energy budget are already committed for the next 30 years to treating radioactive waste. So, let's not be naive about nuclear being sustainable or environmentally friendly. It's not at all.
Well, I'm certainly not arguing for nuclear. I'm just saying that the tension that seems to be at the heart of the book, and I know you're not the author. It's basically you're here standing in for them and helping to explain their arguments. But in terms of this, what seems to be a tension, let's put it kindly, between the idea of having a nature-centered or nature-patterned system and one in which technology taken to the nth degree is the key enabler for that to actually happen. and that technology comes at a cost. I mean, we talk about just transition.
Yeah.
I'm wondering when we're going to start talking about just transition for everybody who's put out of work by AI in the next 10 years, as opposed to people in the oil industry. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, and I'd love Michael and Yasmine to
Yeah.
come back in here about all of these issues that we're getting onto, which I'm enjoying. I mean, I think it seems to me that humanity is in a very perilous space right now, wherever you look, right? There's chaos everywhere. There's wars everywhere. You know, the man who came in saying he was going to stop all wars, we now have more wars than we've ever had. I mean, not ever, but for a long time, we've got wars literally everywhere. So I think we've got to try something new, right? And we've got to get from extractive to stellar, like we've got to get from caterpillar to butterfly. How we do that is a movement of people. It's not top-down, it's bottom-up. Change fundamentally, when it's big change, era change, paradigm change, it's from the margins and from the bottom up. We moved on from human slavery in 1833 in the UK by abolishing it with the Abolitionist Act. They fought a civil war in America over the same topic, the same issue of human slavery, with lots of people dying, families against families. At that time, interestingly, the Democrats were arguing that they should keep slavery, and the Republicans were saying, no, we need to get rid of slavery and we need to be the Union rather than the South succeeding. Now it's the other way around. Republicans want to keep fossil fuels. Democrats are saying, no, actually we found a better way. We put in the Inflation Reduction Act. The fastest growing part of the economy is the green economy. Let's get behind that. And it's similar but different, because we have a moral and an economic case that are converging, just like we had in 1833. And when you have a moral and economic case that's converging, you've got to find a new way. What do you think, Yasmine or Michael?
Well, I was going to ask Michael, I mean, coming back to your your activist roots, in terms of that, I mean, it does seem like this argument that there's a moral and economic component to this. I mean, what was the view in Fridays for the Future about the moral case versus the need to make an economic case?
Well, I think we never were against something like the narrative of having abundant electricity, for example. Well, I just have my difficulties with a narrative that is quite broad, and it doesn't really show me how we can reach the goal. And I think that's slightly dangerous, because, I mean, at some point, even if we want to shift into the space of a world where we have a lot of renewables that provide relatively cheap energy, we need a lot of political support to get there. And I've seen just in the past years, looking at my country, but also looking at the European Union and other countries that had similar problems, many policies that were not fit to get us there in speed. And I just mentioned the one policy before with batteries in Austria. So I think while we have the broader picture and the broader narrative, we really also need to look into that. And to figure out how we can push our politicians to bring us down the path that enables this new world.
And Yasmine, I mean, are you seeing, you operate in a political context where you're trying to start a new business, you're trying to launch that, you're dealing with stakeholders as part of an existing system that Charles wants to see abolished pretty soon rather than later. How do you reconcile that kind of tension, the idea that you're becoming part of a system that the two gentlemen to your left and right think needs to be fundamentally altered? Do you think there's a danger of helping to give that system more longevity if system change is indeed required?
I think it depends how you plan to use the system and exploit it in the right ways. So what we've done is basically we built an ecosystem of support from lots of corporate partners. So we've got people like Huawei, Sage, Samsung, the big partners that can help us with the resources, the advice, the different support they've got. And essentially when you create that sort of ecosystem of support, you're more likely to drive a more successful movement. And it is really all about the movements, because as individuals you think your choices don't really matter. But you're not an individual, we're basically a collection of 8 billion people. And the choices we make together, no matter how small, have the power to disrupt and reshape entire supply chains. And I guess as one person, you typically think it's not your responsibility, it's up to the corporations. But actually, if you dig a bit deeper, it's a demand that we as customers place that drives the corporations to act the way they do. So if we change the demand, you end up changing the system. And that's essentially what creating a movement is all about.
Mm-hmm. And do you worry at all about, again, we talked in the green room about your model in terms of what you were doing to raise capital. And you said I'm not saying something out of turn here, but you said you were going to avoid raising venture, with the implications that the expected returns would lead to we've seen whole generations of startups where lead to a whole set of incentives that sometimes go into places that they don't initially plan to go to. So what is your rationale? Why are you not planning on raising venture capital funding?
So I think every time I've discussed this with someone, they typically say, but there are some impact VCs, why don't you consider those? I guess the issue is when you take VC money, you tend to have to sacrifice a bit of the impact to maximize a bit of the profit. Mm-hmm. And it's always the case, if you're going for an impact VC, if you're going for any other VC. And I think we're so mission-driven and we believe in what we're doing because we can create both revenue for the customers we've got and also the impact at a large level. And any imbalance in that sort of system can make a solution a lot less attractive and less widely adopted, but we need maximum adoption to create maximum impact. So that's one of the reasons we've completely avoided VC, even though we've received quite significant inbound VC interest.
Okay. I want to ask a question. We talked before as well about how people going into entrepreneurship, particularly in an impact space or climate space, that it's a reaction to them seeing both something needs to be different in the world, but also a particular approach to it. Were you tempted to follow the activist route before you chose to set this up with Carbon Track?
Yeah, so I did work with a couple of startups as a volunteer for campaigns to do a bunch of different things. Some of them were switching your electricity to a greener provider. Small little actions again. But it got to a point where I wanted to be part of the system that catalyzes that change at a global level. And yes, activism does drive it at a global level, but at the end you need solutions that tackle the problems at the root before you end up with CO2 at the end. Because I feel like one of the other reasons sustainable startups tend to be not so profitable because they kind of tackle carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions at the end of their life, so after they've been emitted. But if you tackle problems at the root cause, then you can change an entire thing. And that's what really interested me in entrepreneurship in the first place, tackling problems at a larger scale and driving a movement.
Okay. So, I think, movement seems to be a common theme across, all the different endeavors of what we've been talking about so far. How do you think movements themselves need to change? Are there blind spots that movement have? Do they need a focal point of leaders? You talk about bottom-up, Charles. I don't know what that actually looks like. Maybe can you help me out in explaining?
Yeah, I think if you talk about movements, you want to look back in history at the successful movements. So let's take the civil rights movement, right, bottom up. And it was a long, hard slog, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, you name it, in America, and then obviously in lots of other countries, including my country, Nelson Mandela, who's one of my heroes. My son's named after him. This is bottom up. We were told that he was a communist and a terrorist. And there was nothing good about this guy, and that's why he should be banished to Robben Island. In fact, they wanted to hang him. And 1964, the judge showed a little bit of clemency by not hanging him. That's what everyone expected, that he was going to be hung, the death penalty in 1964. But he got life in prison. Came out, I was there within 10 feet of him when he came out as a free man, and he spoke to us in Cape Town, in Parliament Square. Survived a long day. He had survived 27 years in jail, but anyway, I survived one long day because he was supposed to speak to us at 11 a.m. and he only actually spoke to us at 6 p.m. He showed up, and everyone thought he'd been abducted, so all hell broke loose. But the point is that he came out of prison after 27 years, and I wondered, had they broken him, was he still able to save South Africa, which looked like it was going to go into a nasty civil war at that point. And his speech at 6 p.m. was actually very disappointing because the reason he was delayed was they'd been hashing through a speech. As a servant of the people, he was saying, guys, let's write it together, you tell me what you want me to say. But it was death by 1,000 edits. So he tried to then read the speech and he couldn't see because of his eye problems from manual labor on Robben Island. He was borrowing reading glasses from his friend Mac Maharaj and trying to get through the speech. Disaster. Very next day, he flew to Johannesburg, went to the live television studios, unannounced, unexpected, walked in, got everyone eating out of his hand, said, how do you speak to the nation? There's the camera. When the red light goes on, speak to them. And he said, right. And he spoke to South Africans and the world, and he said, if I can forgive them, you can forgive them. And the whole country just calmed down. Mm-hmm. And the bottom-up movement just developed this positive energy after that. Because he'd only just come out of prison. It took 4 years for him to become president, right? So whether it's the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the abolitionists of slavery, suffragettes, these are all successful bottom-up movements. And I think that's what we need, whether we call it stellar or something else. We need this bottom-up movement of people, every person in this room, for example. I see lots of young people here. That's what we need. A groundswell that says enough is enough. We don't like this drill, baby, drill narrative from the top. We don't like all these thugs who are running the world and ruining it for us. It's time for a whole new change. We're going to lead. At every stage, every age, we're going to lead.
So how does that reconcile with this idea that, the system's going to change if, isn't Yasmine going to be put out of business if that's going to be, the system that is instantiated, that we're getting rid of this top-down system? And does that worry you, Yasmine?
Which part?
Putting your life into a business, again, it's a microcosm of how a lot of people would see this as a challenge and potentially a threat, right? The idea that, a lot of effort and time and money has gone into something, and, other people are saying, well, that the entire system needs to be changed radically in order to, correct an evil. So how does that make you feel, being part of the evil?
I guess you can't really change something unless you try. So that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Give it a shot. If it works, fantastic. If it doesn't work, we try something else to try to make it work. Learn from the mistakes we made, use that to build something else afterwards.
Okay. Michael?
Well, I think the interesting thing about the energy transition is that even if we change the system, even if we manage to bring emissions down, we did it by technology that has been still developed in the old system that we are currently now living in. And I think the current system has proven to be very effective in bringing technology costs down. If we look at the costs of batteries, if we look at the costs of solar PV, wind energy, that's all dropped by 90% partially, by huge amounts only in the last 10, 15 years. So yes, I think that's probably something that we need to consider.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this, Michael, because I think you spend a lot of time thinking about narrative and studying its structures and how it can be deployed in various ways. Many people would say, I'd say, that narratives have three main key components, right? A victim, a villain, and a vindicator. So the hero comes in to basically rescue the victim from the baddie, the villain. Who is the baddie in the narrative that we need to be telling? Who is the enemy? Who's the villain?
Well, I think there's different version of explaining this narrative.
It's all safe. It's a safe space. You're among friends.
Well, I think we tend to claim that the fossil fuel industry is the bad guy,
aren't they,
in the whole equation. And I think there's a good argument for this because, fossil fuel companies have been lobbying governments and they have been misleading society into this dependency on oil, on gas, on coal. So I think I acknowledge that firms somehow need to make money in the current system. Mm-hmm. But what really annoys me is if firms lobby governments into a direction that is just super destructive for society. And I think there's been a lot of positive signs in the recent years that at the European level, and there's just been a new report coming out in May, many more companies are now lobbying in support of climate action at the European level compared to back 2019. So there's been a quite strong shift. And this also gives me somehow hope that even if we stay within the current system that we have, I think there's a major shift in how stakeholders behave. And I think, following up on what Charles said, movements need to be broad. So they shouldn't exclude someone just because we assume they're currently not willing to go the way with us. I think there are many, and the more people come together, the more different flavors and perspective we bring into the narrative, the stronger the narrative is. Because there's also not one narrative. There's different narratives for different people with different understandings, and you need to reach all of them.
And I think, you're talking about a redemption arc. Right? You're talking about the idea that the villain can become the hero by redeeming themselves and actually atoning for what they've done and finding a way forward. So let me ask you, Charles. I mean, it's something that I think, getting from A to B. First of all, let me just ask you, in terms of the story that you think we should be telling, the narrative we should be embracing, is there an enemy, and who is the enemy in that story?
Well, look, I think organizations are made up of individuals, right? And those individuals can change. And we've seen a lot of business leaders change in the last 30 years to become really passionate about sustainability. I want to remind you of an amazing man called John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. Now, he was a slaver. He was captain of a slave ship before he had his eureka moment. And why he was so helpful to the abolitionists and to William Wilberforce as the leader of the abolitionists in the UK was because he knew what the conditions were like for those slaves on those British ships. And as I said, with the British Empire, Britain drove the slave trade. Britain was the predominant nation, the wealthiest nation, like America is today. It was Britain, of course, on the backs of the slave trade, on the backs of individuals, on the backs of a slaver called John Newton, who then changed and became a leading abolitionist. And then we had the abolition of slavery, thanks to people like William Wilberforce, John Newton, and the abolitionists, right? So these individuals, I was at BP for 6 years. There are lots of really good people that have left BP and are doing amazing work in renewables all over the world. Because, a company like BP did hire the brightest people. And when I was young, a lot of bright people wanted to go to BP. Now they don't really. You could ask the people in the audience whether any of them would want to go and work for BP. I didn't want to work for BP straight out of undergrad. I did want to work for BP out of my MBA because I wanted to change BP from an oil and gas company to a global green energy company. And we came up with Beyond Petroleum in the year 2000. I was in the group marketing team that did that, and then I ran renewables at BP for 3 years, and we got $8 billion into creating BP Alternative Energy. We were the leading renewable energy company in the world at that point. Unfortunately, it then all went backwards post-2006 when I left BP, and John Brown had left, who was the chief exec who drove the Beyond Petroleum agenda, even though he was an oil guy. He had seen something. He made a famous speech at Stanford Business School, which is where he went, about the precautionary principle on climate change. He was probably the first captain of industry to talk about climate change, 1997. And I studied that, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to go to BP. I thought, well, if the chief exec has spotted something, then I will go and help them. Otherwise I'll go to Greenpeace, right? So it's in the tent or out the tent. Where can you have an influence? Mm-hmm. BP, unfortunately, is an embarrassment to the world at this point, as is Shell, as is ExxonMobil. Honestly, I don't have anything good to say about those companies. It's horrific. The leadership of those companies is so irresponsible. I asked Imperial College students, Masters of Climate and Sustainability, the other day when I spoke to them, 300 of them. The first question I asked is, does anyone here know what the parts per million of CO2 are in the atmosphere right now? Only one person out of 300 people actually knew the answer to that. It's over 420 parts per million. When I did the training with Al Gore in Nashville and Jim Hansen, the climate scientist, in 2007 for a week, the thing we were told by those guys, quite clearly with the graphs that we were studying, was that if you go above 350 parts per million, you're in uncharted territory, which is why there's lots of 350 organizations, 350.org, 350 this, 350 that. Over 400, Jim Hansen said, we're really heading for catastrophe. Now we're 425. Mm-hmm. We're in the end zone. And these guys are still burning fossil fuels left, right, and center and investing more and more money into burning more and more fossil fuels. Total addiction. Responsible leadership is getting us off fossil fuels like we got off human slavery. British East India Company didn't survive okay, because it didn't adapt. So it was gone from the face of the earth after slavery. All these companies are going to disappear unless they wake up. And, we need a revolution.
Well, Yasmine, I mean, revolution, it's how do you have a revolution globally, though? I mean, it's something you're talking about, trying to change consumer behavior one person at a time, one company at a time. Does it stack up? I mean, and when you're telling stories about this, I'm going to ask you the same question. Is there a villain in that story that you tell?
No. Well, I guess yes, because the systems are wired against us in that sort of sense. But we're trying to make everybody a bit of a hero in that sort of sense. So every time you make a little swap, it tells you make the swap like 6 more times, you'd save a turtle's worth of ocean plastic or Arctic ice for penguins. Because people don't really connect with raw numbers, like CO2 savings, but they do connect with things they can picture, care about, and act on. And with regards to taking it global, I think, so we are on a mission to cut UK emissions by 5% by 2030 through the power of small actions. And I think people don't realize that making such small changes in your diet, like swapping dairy milk for oat milk just for coffee, can cut UK emissions by about 1.1%. And such a small action, you don't really think about it, but they do add up. And if just changing the milk in your coffee can cut 1.1%, and swapping red meat to white meat just twice a week can cut it by around 2.7. That's exactly what we're trying to do. Small little shifts in lifestyle do add up, and we've got the corporate partners to help us scale globally to different parts. The United Nations is very interested in the results of our pilots once we do finish them with Sainsbury's.
Fabulous.
Hopefully.
Great. Well, let me ask you each an exit question then, because we're coming up to time. So I want to start with you, Michael. So what is the one thing that you think needs to be different to build trust to get to from A to B, to get to this other place that we need to get to, however you define that? What is missing from how we talk about these things? Are things like the London Climate Action Weeks actually helpful to that, or are they ways for us to be distracted from the kind of revolutionary type of activities that Charles is talking about? What needs to happen? What needs to change?
Well, I do think it's important to come together and have the conversation. Of course, time is running, but in the end, I think, and this is also what I take away from the Stella book, the narrative matters. I think it is important to find good narratives, and we should also find narratives that work for all people. So, for example, I would argue, if you just have a story that simplifies things to a great extent, maybe you would not have the engineers on board that are actually implementing the solar PV, that are putting the solar PV on a rooftop. So I think we somehow need to be honest. We need to be honest what is possible and what we can achieve in a given time, at least at the concrete level where we talk about policy, where we talk about implementation. I think that's key. We really need to get stuff done. And there might be overarching narratives, for example, long-term visions of producing very cheap green electricity. Nevertheless, it is important that we unite all the people with all the different talents at the table, and we figure out how we can get stuff done, what policies we need, and what the communication then is to people, to governments, and to businesses. And I think it's a major problem that the climate movement is so dispersed. If I look into my own field, which is direct activism, I think many of us tend to avoid talking to people from business, maybe also people from politics. And we can learn a lot from each other, I think. This is why it's important that we come here together. The London Climate Action Week is probably a place where people come together. And if we listen, we can learn, we can improve our narratives and our actions. And
Yasmine, do you buy that? If activism can learn from business, what can business learn from activism?
Well, they work hand in hand. Activism can drive business, and business can drive activism if they're both aligned on the same mission, I guess.
Can they do so do they have to know that they're doing that? Or because there are a lot of activists who might disagree with that statement pretty vociferously.
I mean, if you find a way that you're able to please every stakeholder, then yes. But again, it's very rare where you're able to find a business solution that is able to achieve that.
Indeed, yes. And what would you say needs to be done differently in how we talk about these things in order to build trust?
I think there's a lot of talk and a lot of fluff around London Climate Action Week. And we can't really drive such policies or change at scale without having policymakers in the room. So I think we should always have policymakers in the room at these events. I don't think any of the Climate Action Week events should run without a policymaker in the room, because essentially that's what we're trying to do, right? But it's not such a great thing just to have people. Yes, having people is fantastic, but we need the policymakers to drive the change and make it materialize into proper impact.
Well, I mean, I've tried to play the devil's advocate role a few times on this stage this afternoon. So, Charles, I want to ask you that same question to wrap us up. What needs to be different in how we talk about these things in order to build the trust? Because when you say revolution, some people are going to get very scared.
Well, look, the Industrial Revolution is one of the success stories in terms of what replaced slavery, right? So Britain pioneered the Industrial Revolution. It was the greatest economic opportunity that we'd ever seen up until now. But now, why don't we have the global sustainability revolution? Why do we need to be scared of that word, right? Industrial revolution was very positive. Now we need the global sustainability revolution. So we have to have hope. Hope is the key thing. The book Stella gives me hope. It's one of the few things that has actually given me hope recently. And that's why I talk about Stella so often. We need hope. I think there's despair everywhere. And I think a superabundant future is possible. I mean, like that butterfly, it's based on infinite energy, not finite energy, and infinitely clean, cheap energy, affordable, near zero marginal cost energy, right? Superabundance. The data centers for AI can all gravitate towards those nodes, right? This is really amazing innovation opportunity for everybody all over the world. Job creation, bringing people out of poverty in a clean way. Fossil fuels brought people out of poverty to some extent, but in a dirty way. When you have 8 billion people burning 1.5 million years worth of fossilized matter every week, it's unsustainable. It was fine when there was 1 billion people, but not when there's 8 billion people. With the technology that we've got at the moment of how we get stuff out the ground, the Gulf of Mexico oil spill that BP was responsible for happened because they were drilling 3 kilometers beneath the sea. That's called difficult oil and gas. All these oil companies are only going after what they call unconventional or difficult oil and gas. Tar sands is difficult oil and gas, right? That's desperation. That's looking for the last vein to inject yourself because we're addicted. So hope is getting off fossil fuels because that's pollution. Getting into a clean society that addresses inequality, addresses climate change. And we start collaborating. Radical collaboration is one of my favorite phrases.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it during London Climate Action Week. So for us here at Ladbroke Hall, thanks to our partners again at Extreme Hangout for allowing us to use this amazing space. Thanks to my panel who've come together today to talk about these issues. Charles Perry, Yasmine Abdu, Michael Spiekermann, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank all of you.
The night I look for love. I get my strength from the man above. God of piston, God of steel. God is here behind my wheel. I'm just working for the man. Ooh.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
Keep